Why did you choose to launch a campaign to discredit Roy Moore's accusers?
You say that I declared war on Moore's accusers, and I'm just wondering, why did you report that, given what I told you?
Look, I can't speak on behalf of the publication.
Did your editor write the sentence?
I can't comment on that.
So I came in the office this morning, and I saw that the New York Observer actually printed a correction. Journalism is more art than science, but dishonest journalism is neither art nor science. It is simply trash and noise. The thing about propaganda, to quote F.I. Hayek, is that the whole apparatus for spreading knowledge, including the media, will be used to spread views which, true or false, will strengthen the decisions taken by authority, and all information that might cause doubt or hesitation will be withheld. It's that withholding of facts, which run contrary to a story that is already written, which is the subject of our focus today. Davis Richardson of the Observer newspaper called my publisher of the book American Pravda the other day, asking for an interview, saying he wanted to talk about American Pravda. He used a ploy to get the interview. He wasn't really interested in the book at all. He wanted to write about our controversial Washington Post investigation.
Yeah, how's the tour going?
It's going great. I was in New Hampshire yesterday and spoke to the University of New Hampshire. We had two events, one in the National Press Club, and one in New York. Did you see the speech of the National Press Club?
I saw pictures from it.
After interviewing me, he wrote a story with a crazy and unfounded allegation written as fact. Quote, "By attacking the Post, O'Keefe declared war on Moore's accusers and the entire women's movement against sexual misconduct." Unquote. I think it's time we deconstruct this entire false narrative and set the record straight by looking at both the Washington Post reporting and, by way of example, how this is manifested in this New York Observer interview, journalistic malpractice unbound. Last year, Project Veritas sent an undercover reporter to meet with Washington Post reporters to expose their bias. Our journalist posed as a victim of Roy Moore to get a meeting. The undercover reporter got burned in the process. But the Post didn't like us investigating them, and without evidence or facts, they prescribed a motive to our investigation. In late November of last year, the Post made this assertion first, quote, "The group's efforts illustrate the lengths to which activists have gone to try to discredit media outlets for reporting on allegations from multiple women that Moore pursued them when they were teenagers and he was in his early 30s, unquote. Kind of a juxtaposed quote there. Note how the Post doesn't directly state that we were trying to plant a fake story, because at this point all they had was evidence that we were just using an alias of a victim. Just using an alias or a tactic doesn't mean you're going to go through with the thing. A few days later, after the first Post article, came this Post headline, quote, "The failed effort by conservative activists to plant a false story about Senate candidate Roy Moore in the Washington Post was part of a months-long campaign to infiltrate the Post," unquote. So this is where the leap takes place. Right there, the Washington Post decides to assign a factual motive and a result to our investigation by creating a narrative that we were trying to plant a false story. They made us villains. Let's see how the Washington Post justifies this leap. Eric Wemple of the Washington Post asked me about our motive and objective, but then argued an alternative narrative with false premise that led to an erroneous conclusion. Quote, "There's a very surface-level problem with O'Keefe's protestations. It results from logic. When you deploy an operative to send in a false tip to a newspaper, you are, in effect, attempting to plant a fake story." Let's take a look at Wemple's flawed logic. Premise 1, a Project Veritas journalist used false story to get a meeting. Premise 2, anybody who sends a false tip to a newspaper is attempting to plant a fake story. Conclusion, Project Veritas attempted to plant a false story. False. Wemple's premise and conclusion denies all empirical and historical facts from the history of undercover journalism. When Nellie Bly feigned insanity to investigate insane asylums, she wasn't seeking psychiatric care. When Upton Sinclair dressed as a worker to investigate the meatpacking industry, he didn't plan to actually become a meatpacker himself. When I posed as a pimp and Acorn advised me how to start a brothel evading the authorities, I did not actually attempt to start up a brothel. And when I said to a corrupt teachers union official that I hit a kid and then went on a vacation to Mexico, I didn't actually hit a kid, nor did I actually intend to go to Mexico, even though I said these things. So Wemple's logic is obviously flawed. Undercover journalists use ploys, covers, alias to gain access, to build trust. The alias and the cover aren't the story. The story is exposing the corruption and the malfeasance, period. But this false narrative has stuck, and Observer reporter Richardson repeated it, but taking the false thesis even further with an outrageous conclusion. Quote, by attacking the Post, O'Keefe declared war on Moore's accusers and the entire women's movement against sexual misconduct. Which brings us to the interview itself. Richardson had written his story before he even did his reporting. The interview with me was pro forma. He knew his conclusions and couldn't have cared less about what I said. It's a when did you stop beating your wife approach, or a judge saying to an already convicted criminal, tell me why I was wrong to convict you.
Why did you choose to launch a campaign to discredit Roy Moore's accusers when you later admitted to believing them?
Well, I didn't. It had nothing to do with Ray Moore. Ray Moore was a means to an end. It was an alias. That's not what we did. It was an alias used to gain a meeting with a Washington Post reporter. Richardson interviewed me for his article, and by the end of this piece, he did quote me accurately when I addressed the false allegation of planting the story. Too little, too late. His earlier conclusion, presented as a statement of fact about our motives and result, was the story. My denial was an afterthought.
Hello?
Hey, is this Mr. Richardson?
Yes.
Hey, this is James O'Keefe from Project Veritas. You just have 1 second?
Hi, James. How's it going?
Good, good. I'm just curious. You said I declared war on Moore's accusers, and I'm just wondering why did you report that, given what I told you?
What up? Well, I think that's an argument that many people had seen in regards to the discrediting
He's on mute.
of those accusers.
My intent was never to plant a false story, but you take it further when you say that my intent was to, quote, declare war on victims of abuse, so forth and so on. So, again, what is that based on?
Look, I can't speak on behalf of the publication. I'd be more than happy to pass you along to our editor.
Well, did your editor write the sentence?
I can't comment on that.
So I came in the office this morning and I saw that the New York Observer actually printed a correction. Quote, his sting on the Post was seen by many as a declaration of war against Moore's accusers and the entire women's movement against sexual misconduct. And the piece has an editor's note at the end. I'm going to read you this editor's note. Quote, the original line in the story read, by attacking the Post, O'Keefe declared war on Moore's accusers and the entire women's movement against sexual misconduct. The line was changed by the editor after the reporter was confronted by Mr. O'Keefe over this particular sentence and threatened with litigation. So let me get this straight. The New York Observer commits an error. Now, they correct the error, but only because, as they say in their editor's note, they were threatened with litigation. They were so flippant in their characterization of what we do at Project Veritas that their reporter folded like a cheap suit, utterly unable to defend his claim, his voice quivering on the phone when I confronted him about his erroneous smear. We're doing a story on this. If you don't have any comment, you don't have a comment?
Can I get back to you?
Sure. Let me give you my number. They're only compelled to tell the truth when they're threatened with litigation? How many errors like this go unnoticed or unchallenged in the New York Observer or in the rest of the mainstream media? Mr. Richardson, do your job. Be better. Because your work to date is contributing to the demise of journalism. And now your black eye will forever be memorialized on our wall of shame.